Hey everybody, this is a piece by Mel Rothenberg. It's from the Science and Society uh, journal. It's titled "Some Lessons from the Failed Transition to Socialism." I'm reading this because it's part of the Science and Society journal volume that is specifically about. Um, there's a lot of commentary on Marcel Linden's Western Marxism in the Soviet Union and the Russian question generally. Um, I don't anticipate good takes in this piece, but we shall see. So here we go. Some lessons from the failed transition to socialism by Mel Rothenberg. 30 years ago, I, along with Mike Goldfield, authored a book titled "The Myth of Capitalism Reborn," which is a polemic against the then current Maoist thesis that capitalism had been restored in the Soviet Union. Mike and I were settling accounts with our Maoist past, and in doing so had to take up in depth the issues subsequently dealt with in van der Linden's book, Western Marxism in the Soviet Union, and in Liebman's comments on it. While much of the detail in our work is historically dated, I believe our approach still yields some insight into a contemporary analysis of these questions that remain important in the rebuilding of a significant socialist movement. Liebman's concluding position that the USSR was formally socialist but never succeeded in attaining real socialism is only briefly and too cryptically elaborated. Still, it seems close to our position that the Soviet Union was a society where the process of transition to socialism was initiated but never completed and consolidated for reasons indicated in Liebman's article. Our emphasis on, quote, process and, quote, protracted transition, I believe, is more historically and analytically fruitful than the static contrast between, quote, formal and, quote, real, but the positions seem pretty close, and the difference is itself probably more formal than real. Given the length limitation of a communication, I can't really give an adequate elaboration or defense of this thesis. Rather, I will point out the rather profound political conclusions that this thesis carries for any project of building a socialist society. In particular, it necessitates a serious revision of traditional Marxist conceptions of attaining socialism. In a formulation that goes back to Engels, the traditional Marxist schema for building socialism has two phases. In the first phase, the working class, having attained sufficient social weight and level of organization, gains control of the state apparatus. Engels thought this would occur through parliamentary elections. The Bolsheviks later modified this to armed insurrection. Having gained control of the state, the workers' government would quickly seize control of the means of production and transfer this control to bodies representing the working class. This would then complete the transition to at least the first or lower stage of socialism. The emphasis on process and protracted transition required by 20th century experience calls this scenario into question in many ways. First, the view that attaining control of the state apparatus by the working class can occur at a single moment, either through an election or insurrection, and be quickly consolidated is not tenable. The gaining and consolidation of state power is a long and complicated process, subject to twists and turns, advances and retreats. This was true in the USSR, China, and all other countries where communist parties came to power via internal revolutions rather than being imposed by the Red Army. You could argue that China's communism was also initiated by a Red Army under the leadership with a peasant base. An army with a peasant base that kind of extended its victories militarily throughout the country. That's at least how some people would characterize the nature of the Chinese Revolution. Even more important, the very notion of working class state power is not transparent. The classical Marxist notion that such power will be exercised through a political party that represents the working class is a fundamental ambiguity, because the word, quote, represents, end quote, has two distinct and sometimes contradictory meanings. The first meaning is that the party directly represents the current politics of the majority of the working class, that its leadership and program is directly responsible to and subject to change by that majority. This is the traditional radical democratic ideal. Unfortunately, it is also utopian. For this to be real, there must be vibrant, direct democratic mechanisms for assessing and enforcing the will of the majority, and a working class educated, mature, and united enough on basics so that political differences don't lead to endless conflict and chaos. These preconditions never existed anywhere, especially not in industrially undeveloped pre-revolutionary Russia or in any state where communist parties took power. And the Communist Party Soviet Union never represented Russian workers in this radical democratic sense. The second meaning of, quote, represents is that the party represents the long-term interests of the working class and has behind it a loyal following of a layer of advanced workers who are able to articulate and defend these interests. This is, of course, Lenin's formulation, and more realistically describes the self-conception of the Communist Party Soviet Union and other communist and social democratic parties during their most vigorous and viable periods. The notion of the party representing the long-term interests of the working class depends on the assumption that the working class is monolithic, at least insofar as long-term interests go, and therefore a unified party can represent such interests. This may be true if, quote, long-term, end quote, means projecting broad interest into the distant future, but the politics of governing is about narrow interest in the here and now, and the party must function in the chaos and confusion of the present. Looking at politics as a process that occurs in real time, there are always sharp conflicts among sections of the working class, contradictions based on immediate economic interests, but also differences in nationality, religion, and culture, and this was particularly true in the multinational, multiracial Soviet Union. This is further complicated by the fact that lacking vibrant democratic mechanisms, and thus without direct workers' control, the Communist Party Soviet Union and other ruling parties inevitably became a vehicle for preserving the power and privileges of particular sections of the class and of the party apparatus. The advanced workers who were its base identified more with a section of the class and the party apparatus, and the privileges granted them by this apparatus, than they did with the working class as a whole. The most problematic aspect of this conception of worker state power in the period of transition is that it ignores the crucial and necessary role of whole layers of intermediate strata in maintaining and sustaining a modern industrial society. Managers, technicians, doctors, nurses, educators, bankers, airline pilots, social workers, small business entrepreneurs, fashion designers, and software designers are all vital to this task. These are professionals with higher education who have served the reigning capitalist order and have obtained privileges vis-a-vis the working class for doing so. The traditional Marxist assumption that they would switch their allegiance to the workers in power has nowhere materialized. Rather, everywhere where communists came to power, the great mass of these strata have fled to more inviting capitalist shores. Nor, contrary to Liebman's claim, have those born after communist or revolutionary seizures of power and educated under socialist regimes ceased to identify with their counterparts in advanced capitalist society, seeking the same status and privileges. They were certainly an important force in the collapse of the Soviet Union, and in China represent the most pro-capitalist sectors of society. The deepest analysis of these questions is that of the Italian communist leader Antonio Gramsci. Gramsci's writings are scattered and mostly still not translated, but a good reference is Sassoon, 1980. Summarizing pages 119 to 125 of that work, Gramsci points out that the core values and perspectives of all social layers have been built up over centuries of international capitalist development under the social, political, and ideological hegemony of the bourgeoisie. Socialists cannot fundamentally transform this simply through a monopoly of state power. What is needed, according to Gramsci, is the creation of a whole new social bloc that consists of a fusion of the most progressive members of all productive sectors. To effectively advance a socialist agenda, such a bloc must be anchored by the most class-conscious sectors of the working class, but must also draw in other necessary classes and strata. The major task of the proletarian party, according to Gramsci, is to promote the construction of such a social bloc and to lead the fight for its hegemony, a task that will stretch over generations. This fight involves contesting for state power, but the more fundamental and decisive struggle will be in the realm of civil society, where basic social practices and attitudes are rooted. This is not the place to elaborate the details of Gramsci's conception, its strengths and weaknesses. Gramsci himself was a Leninist who felt his conception applied mainly to a mature bourgeois society such as Italy, whereas in the more backward semi-feudal Russian context with an undeveloped civil society, the focus on the state as the shaper and mover of social reality was correct. The irony was that insofar as the Soviet state succeeded in constructing a modern industrial economy, it lost more and more of its capacity to control social reality and its ideological hegemony to the new educated layer it created. The failure to make the transition from the rule of a single party to the hegemony of a new social bloc drove the Soviet middle strata and large sections of the working class to identification with the aspirations and lifestyles of their more affluent Western counterparts. This was reinforced by the leadership of the Communist Party Soviet Union, who framed the task of socialism as catching up and surpassing capitalism in the realm of consumption. When this failed to materialize, the legitimacy of the Soviet regime was severely compromised among the mass of Soviet citizens. This is the first nail in its coffin. No one who is interested in fundamental social transformation can ignore the issue of state power. The state in the hands of reactionaries can block real social advance. But the obsessive focus on the part of 20th century communists and revolutionaries on the state mystified the role of the state and ignored the limitations of the state in initiating deep and permanent social transformation. One of the great and sad lessons of the Soviet experience is that after 70 years of uninterrupted communist rule, the Soviet Union rather easily and quickly reverted back to a deformed but thoroughly capitalist society. The roots of the socialist order turned out to be weak and shallow. These considerations lead to a perspective on the second phase of Engels' classic formulation on the transition to socialism. Engels argued that, having gained control of the state, the workers must quickly seize the means of production from the capitalists and place them under the management of bodies controlled by the workers. However, the notion of workers' control of the means of production, just as the notion of workers' control of the state, suffers from two contradictory interpretations. The first notion is that the workers in each enterprise collectively determine what is produced, how much is produced, and how it is produced. That is, they control the end product, the quantity, the structure, and rhythm of production. This vision is shared by a fairly broad spectrum of socialist theorists, including Resnick and Wolff, critiqued accurately by Linden in his review, who advocated from a syndicalist perspective, to David Schweikart, the most eminent contemporary proponent of market socialism. Without debating the merits of this position, which could be called workplace socialism, I would join with Linden and almost all the major Marxist parties in dismissing this interpretation as non-Marxist. To Marxist, socialism means collective ownership of the whole of society, i.e. social ownership of the various means of production, not each employee owning a share of the enterprise at which she or he works. There is then a very profound question of the mechanism through which the social ownership is to be exercised. In the mature Soviet model, this mechanism was a central national economic plan and planning commission answerable to the government and party leadership, through which all the important economic decisions and transactions were to be funneled. This mechanism will only represent social ownership if the party and the government represent, quote, all of society, and this raises a whole set of difficulties as we have seen in analyzing the issue of how and whether the party represents the entire working class or only the advanced sector that understands the long-term needs and interests. Here the issue can be posed as follows. Does the plan address itself to the immediate needs, demands, and inadequacies of daily life as experienced by the mass of the population, or to the long-term investment, development, and national security needs as grasped by the party leadership? This question itself must be framed within a historic context. In its first 30 years of existence, the Soviet Union passed through a series of cataclysmic upheavals that put not only the communist regime, but also the whole society at risk of collapse. The revolutionary upheaval in the midst of World War I, the civil war which followed the Bolshevik seizure of power, the forced collectivization of agriculture which in the short run led to terrible famine, followed by the breakneck speed of industrialization, followed by the Nazi invasion that was only repelled after 4 years and 20 million dead. The central planning mechanism in practice didn't grow out of some carefully conceived strategy for building socialism. It grew out of ad hoc and desperate measures taken to confront and overcome a series of crises and specific deadly socioeconomic threats. It also evolved within the regime of Joseph Stalin, a regime that itself was molded and formed in the crucible of these crises. This was a regime of extreme centralization of power and the massive and brutal use of violence to crush all political opposition. Born in such an environment, the central planning process that existed at Stalin's death was totally lacking any functioning mechanism, institutional structure, or historic basis for popular control. It is not necessary or possible in this place to describe in any detail the complex development of the Soviet planning process from the death of Stalin to its demise in 1989. Linden, who has studied the development of the post-Stalin central planning apparatus and process quite deeply, has argued convincingly that it developed complex, sophisticated feedback loops and participatory mechanisms that allowed it to process local needs, views, and demands. Linden's analysis is a good antidote to the caricatures common in the West, which regarded Soviet central planning as simply dictates from the center. However, at the end of the day, the Soviet central planning process failed to provide a sufficiently powerful and effective mechanism of social ownership. In the 1970s, the Soviet economy entered a period of stagnation and slow growth from which it never recovered. There was a failure to adapt production to the IT revolution that was occurring worldwide, and an increasingly wasteful and irrational allocation of natural and capital resources. Agriculture remained backward and unproductive, and there was continued inability to meet fundamental social and consumption needs in housing, medical care, and consumer goods and services. The mass public dissatisfaction that resulted in the tendency to blame all these failures on central planning was a sure sign that the masses were becoming alienated from the system of public ownership. This was the second nail in the coffin of the Soviet Union. The conclusion I would draw from this broad brush analysis is that central ownership and planning, while necessary, no matter how sophisticated the actual process, not sufficient for social ownership. The reason is that, without a broad social bloc, which takes hands-on control of day-to-day productive activity, the responsibility and authority for formulating and implementing any central plan remains the state and party apparatus. No matter what initiatives this apparatus uses to involve broader sections of the population, the plan remains, quote, their, unquote, plan, not our plan. And when there are serious problems, as there always will be, it will be, quote, their fault, not our problem. The goal of socialism is that the entire population becomes the active masters of the economy. But this involves a long historical development that cannot occur within a framework of capitalism. The solution to this in abstract general terms is the growth and development of a social bloc dominated by the working class, which has the capacity to manage the economy better, and the historical mission of gradually expanding to include everyone. How to put meat on these bare bones is a very difficult question, but it might be the right question whose exploration moves us beyond our current impasse. References: Engels, Anti-Düring. Mike Goldfield and Mel Rothenberg, 1989, The Myth of Capitalism Reborn. David Linden, 2009, The Western Left, the Soviet Union and Marxism. Lenin, What is to be Done. Sassoon, Gramsci's Politics. And van der Linden, Western Marxism in the Soviet Union, a survey of critical theories and debate since 1917. Published originally in 2007 in English with Brill.